Optical isn't such a big deal. He's trolling Jensen. He's just made those comments just to troll Jensen.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
Greetings, programs. I am Jay Goldberg.
All right, we got fun stuff to talk about this week. A lot happened. We're going to primarily focus on some earnings, but weave in maybe some thoughts or commentary we caught from the Morgan Stanley TMT conference relative to all the trends in semis we talk about. But as it is, Marvell and Broadcom like to report on the same week, which is fun and interesting because they're somewhat related to each other, at least tangentially in certain categories. We always love a good Hawk 10 outing, and I think he delivered this time, being fairly, what would we say, enthusiastic, optimistic, shooting down some FUD. I mean, all of the things, which was good. So I'll let you sort of start top level, and then let's talk about some of the nuances that came out in his discussions.
So top level, Broadcom reported Hawk 10 was in full effect. He was in fine form. They had a good quarter. They had a strong guidance. And then they really had a very, very strong guidance for 2027 AI revenue. $100 billion in AI semis next year. And just by comparison, they're on a track to do about 50-ish this year. So basically doubling AI revenue next year. Strong numbers. And then I think more than anything, what really sort of tipped the scales for them, right, why the stock reacted so favorably the next day was people really liked the tone of his commentary. I remember last quarter I was convinced last quarter he had a cold because he just didn't sound so good. And that this was back to full effect Hawk 10, like making fun of the analysts and calling people names and like just like everything is fantastic.
All right, so let's do a couple things. I mean, I think he has a very good sense of what, some of the concerns are surrounding their narrative. I mean, this is my view. He's perhaps more perceptive than others. I do want to talk about what you just mentioned, which was related to an analyst who asked a question, and Hawk basically said, "Are you hallucinating on margins?" Because what this brought up, though, is because I then subsequently read a handful of other sell-side notes from the analyst and a host of others. I didn't realize that folks didn't really have a handle on what Broadcom's margins actually were. So it kind of feels like, and we know the analyst in question, so I'm like hesitant to bring up his name, but I feel like most people thought they were in the range that he mentioned, and Hawk was like, "Oh man, are you crazy?" I know people believed that the ASIC, the custom ASIC business margins were higher in the 60s, but I don't think they felt the blended margins were that high, but it kind of feels like he was pointing in that direction. And then just again, to put the pointer on it, I like that he said, "And don't worry about that."
Yeah.
And don't worry about it.
Don't worry about that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the CFO got a similar question, and she walked through this whole explanation. It was a question about whether or not they get the same margins for racks as they do for just selling chips.
Yeah, right.
And she had a very, very long explanation, and she said, "Really, we'll be fine." She said it a few times, "We'll be fine."
Yeah. But I also think that's kind of why he was a little bit more like positive on Stacy Raskin's question, friend of ours, that because he basically was like, "Oh, you're thinking about it, all right. You're thinking about it tied to gigawatts because that's what we sell into." And it's kind of like he's sort of just saying like, "Look, you guys have a model. how much dollars we're going to get per gigawatt. That's how we think about it too. We know that if we can just add capacity, we're going to make more money, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't know. I feel like he's just perceptive of like what you should focus on and what you don't really need to focus on if you really want to try to understand our business. And there was those narrative weaves that I thought were coming out, which was actually helpful, right, from a bystander standpoint.
Yeah, there was I think they gave a lot of color and explanation how their business is working and why they feel confident about it. They made a pretty good case for their growth next year, and I think they're pretty realistic. I don't I, Hawk is known for being very promotional, but also fairly honest, right? I mean, he's a big believer in what he does, but he's not going to tell made up stories. Um, and they have what do they have? 7 custom ASIC customers, right? I like the fact that he keeps pointing out like there are only so many customers we're going to have, and we have 7 of
Yeah,
them, and there are only
he said
only
this
a few more,
right, right.
right? And we it's I keep forgetting my list because I can't remember what's public and what is just rumored, but they have Google and Anthropic and OpenAI. They insist that the Meta project is on track, which you and I
Right.
talked about last week. We thought it was dead, and it's not. It's still going. And good for they got a lot going on there. I mean, the Google one is the majority of it, but they have a lot of other stuff,
Yeah.
right? And Anthropic and OpenAI both working on stuff. So
Yeah. So on their number, I think this is interesting. We were chatting about this. I do think it was important that everybody categorized the right bucket when they said, look at 100 billion in 2027. That it's ASICs and AI networking. It's roughly silicon related to the AI stuff. So the switches, DSPs, um, all of that bit is grouped in there. So it's kind of that whole bucket. That's still an incredible growth rate because I think most people I saw afterwards were like, he's saying 120, he's saying 100, we think it'd be 120. And let's not forget that we mentioned his nice vesting package, the hundreds of millions of dollar vesting package once the business crosses that particular business, AI crosses 60 billion in revenue, then in 2028 it starts vesting as long as he's still there in 2030, which I think we assume he will be. So his compensation package, the big one, stays on track as they grow this at this kind of scale. But I think that just shows. I mean, you can't walk away from that not with a takeaway that this is showing just the absolute ramp of custom ASICs in everybody's infrastructure, which we know is happening with GPUs as well. Like we get it. There was a lot of commentary from Jensen at the Morgan Stanley conference to try to counter that, basically saying, in his words exactly, we're ramping Amazon like mad. Like I think he says that to say like, yeah, they got Trainium, but they're really betting on us. Um, Google is the one though I really find interesting, how much scale they can keep putting to this, um, and I think this is just continuing as a run ramp of scale for that business to be, which I would say to that business to be $100 billion and growing, even with what I believe is a very valid rumor that MediaTek is taking some Google share in TPUs along this timeline. Broadcom is still doing that much money.
yeah, I also think I have I have some technical questions about the MediaTek solution that I think are relevant here and may play into that, which I will not get into. But the basic idea is, yeah, I think Google, of course, is going to try and diversify because Broadcom is not cheap. There's a reason that they have those margins that they do, but they also can deliver a lot. So Google's going to diversify a little bit, and I think they're going to what has been demonstrated is that they're as much as they're trying to find an alternative, they're going to keep coming back to Broadcom because Broadcom has the physical IP and the SerDes that people need.
Yeah.
There's a real differentiation there.
The other part I think is interesting is if you just sort of look out around the timelines we're talking about, and one of the reasons why I think this is starting to ramp, or inflect upwards at a rate that I don't think many expected. Is I think the next series of these chips that they're working on that have just a ton of scale are inference chips or inference focused chips and products, and the volume for inference chips will be far more than training chips. And I think again, if you're a hyperscaler, it makes sense that you focus more on inferencing to monetize those tokens necessarily than training. That's good to have that, but I think their priority for their custom ASICs shifts more toward inferencing stuff we've seen to a degree with Google as well. But the volume of that goes up drastically. And so I think you're seeing this timeline inflect that way as we start to work dedicated inference solutions at volume as well.
I mean, I think what's taking place now is the world is just maxed out at capacity, right? TSMC is maxed out. There are basically 4 or 5 companies that can get real volume out of them, and everybody else can't get in. And that's still not enough compute. If the hyperscalers are going to spend $700 billion on capex this year, that's getting it from TSMC is not enough, and so we're getting it just from NVIDIA is not enough. So they're going to have to get it from Broadcom via their own design. They're going to get it from AMD. That's probably still not enough, and so we're going to start looking at Intel Foundry for packaging at the very least, and maybe some other stuff. And that's uh, largely, but not entirely driven by demand for inference, right? That's why CPUs are going to be short this year, right? Is people just need more compute, and I think everyone's getting less and less picky about it because they'll take what they can get, and they're getting everything they can from NVIDIA, and now everyone's taking everything they can from TSMC, and Samsung and Intel are out there offer something.
Yeah, and I think Jensen spoke for everybody relative to this sub theme in his comments, where he was just really emphasizing, look, compute. We can draw a direct line between compute to revenue. So why is everybody investing the way that they're doing, including in custom silicon to this point with Broadcom and Marvell? It's because they can draw a straight line to compute equals revenue, right? Their only inability to continue making more money is compute constraints. And that, I think, just translates again why we're seeing what we're seeing in the spend, the prioritization, and even to what you said, which is like, well, look, I'm going to get it from everybody, because the bottom line is if we can just get enough, we'll keep seeing our we'll keep monetizing this. But I think that's just the root at the momentum that we're seeing, and why we're seeing this cross board. And to your point about CPUs, like CPUs are going to I think, be constrained for the next couple of years, not just this year. I think we're at a similar structurally cycle for CPUs relative to AI, agentic AI in particular. That's going to be a crunch on CPUs for some time as well.
Yeah, slightly offset by the fact that there's going to be less demand for client, right? But
is what it is. Yeah, I mean, that market is, let's just say, stable-ish to flat. Even if it declines, it's flat-ish.
Yeah,
It's just not. It's not a segment. But yeah. Regardless, I did also like "Long Live Copper" in Hawk Tan's terms.
so yeah, so I want to talk about that, because to me that was the most surprising. That was my favorite.
Yes.
At first I was really surprised, and now in looking back on it, that was my favorite moment.
Let's talk about
the entire
it.
earnings
It's a good
season.
one. It's a good, and it came in light of, I sort of planned it this way for this week, but not that I put out a report on the shift from copper to fiber this week, which he didn't say anything that disagrees with me. It was just, I was saying, look, this transition's coming. And then he was like, we're going to keep copper alive as long as possible. And we think we can do it uniquely. So yeah, it was a good comment.
So I mean, just some background. What he said on the call was that, like, everybody's talking about this shift in the data center to optical, but copper is going to last for a long time. We think we can get copper to work on 400 gig lanes, which is a big surprise to everybody, because, like, there, as we've talked about the show, Austin's talked about it a lot in his, like, we're sort of bumping up against the limits of bandwidth for copper cables. We need to shift to optical, especially when you're talking about scale up GPUs talking to all the other GPUs. And Hawk said, hold on a minute, copper's, we've extended the life of copper many times already, and it's going to keep going here. And this I love this because like this is one of those things like you have if you've been in semis for a long time like this is like a deep cut like because the subtlety of this is really like the irony in this is immense. He's talking up copper, right? Meanwhile, Broadcom has one of the
Yeah.
best silicon
Yep.
photonics chips on the planet,
Probably
right?
the best.
Probably
Yeah.
the best. Like them
Yep.
and Nvidia have this incredible optical interconnect,
Agreed.
co-packaged
Agreed.
optics. They've talked about it before. They talked about it in their last two earnings calls. They talked about this product. It's sampling now. Everybody says the performance is incredible, and yet here he is like saying, "Oh no, hold on, copper's still the thing. We don't, yeah, we have this great product, but we don't need it soon. Because we're going to do so much in copper. We're going to make money on. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter. They're going to make money on both. But I thought it really struck me as odd. Like, why would he go out of his way in his prepared remarks to say this about copper? And it occurs to me, it occurs to me. This is the best part. What happened 2 days before their earnings? Do you know? Is Nvidia invested $2 billion in Lumentum and $2 billion in Coherent, two big optical
Right.
component companies, right?
Right.
And everybody was talking about it because it's clearly it's a very clear signal that from Nvidia's point of view in their systems, co-packaged optics is going to be a big deal, and they're investing this money to lock down capacity to get co-packaged optics lasers basically in time for probably the Feynman launch in what's that 27 late 27, right? Right. And so 2 days before Broadcom's earnings call, Nvidia makes this big bet on optical, and so of course Hock Tan at Broadcom is like, hey,
Yeah.
optical
Yeah.
isn't such a big
So,
deal. He's trolling Jensen. He's just
yeah.
made those comments just to troll Jensen.
Yeah. Right. So, but there are two things though. I mean, look, as Austin has said on our show, and I think is the best way to frame this, which is, uh, copper if you can and optical if you must, right? And so
Right.
it's like, at what point does that threshold? And I'll be honest with you, it's actually great if Marvell or Broadcom has, and Marvell has this too, but if they have the tools to push copper to 800. I now could it go to 1.6? I don't know. That seems to be what everybody believes. The turnover starts to shift toward CPO, but if it could go to 800, fine. The one spot where I think this changes though is it's really going to come down to chips per rack or density per rack of this, because at some point, which for example, like Feynman and Kyber, I took a picture of this. I don't know if you saw it at CES, but the blades go sideways now in these racks because they're pumping, what is it? It'll be 500 something GPUs, I think. So they're sideways. Now, when you got that much density, like you just have to move to optical at that point. Now, NVIDIA might be the only one, right? I'm not saying everybody has to stack this, sideways. This is this, as we talked about before, this optical is the sole reason for scale, whatever. Everybody uses different terms. Like Marvell uses different terms than Broadcom. So scale up, we got to remember there's different terms. But for Google to connect 9,000 plus TPUs required fiber, right, across the stack, but not necessarily in the rack, but from rack to rack, right? So fine, right? But extending that is great. And here's the thing I think is really, really important, because the more research I did became very clear, and this is somewhat true of a copper statement, but it's really going to become more true with optical. Every hyperscaler is taking a very different approach to this, to whatever they're going to do in super dense. I called it the hyperscaler divergence. There isn't one specific like standard way they're going to go. We're going to build this stuff. It's just going to look same. TPUs will look different. Trainium's going to look different. Maya's going to look different. As Microsoft keeps it, they're all going to look different. They've got different needs, different architectures, different choices. Extreme co-optimization. And this is the way that NVIDIA puts this for their verticalization. Everybody is going to have to compete with NVIDIA's extreme co-optimization by designing in and specifically working with these providers, whether that's Lumentum or Coherent or any of the names that we've talked about, in order to deliver on this, their own very specific rack strategy design. And that's coming with this shift, and it's going to be pushed by that density of ASICs, whoever's making them, whatever they are. But I think that's interesting that everybody's going to. So of course it's great. Broadcom's going to be like, yeah, you want to go copper, cool. You want to go optical, cool. Like we can support your divergent strategies, and in fact, the flexibility to do so is one of the reasons they remain the best positioned with their SerDes in the hyperscaler divergence. So anyway, I thought all of that was interesting relative to he's got both boats covered. Like you said, it's just whatever time scale the hyperscalers are on, he'll meet that with either product. You want copper, great. You want optical, great. We've got all you need.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I buy in fully to this idea that everything has to be co-designed. Um, NVIDIA would very much like that to be true. They have shown a strong inclination to vertically integrate as much as possible. I think Broadcom's trying to go down a very different path. We've talked about this a lot before. These two companies have very, very different visions of the future of the data center. I just think it's funny that Hawk is trying to get under Jensen's skin.
Yeah, I mean, it happens every quarter. It's a fun back and forth. All right, let's. Anything left on Broad? Here's the question though I have as you look at the whole business because this came up. Like everybody likes to talk. So basically, what happens is you've got the big shiny. We're all super excited. AI, silicon accelerators, and then there's the dun rest of their business. And it's just kind of like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I look at it and it's just like, you got this great thing. It's this S curve, it's exponential. And then there's other businesses. So it's just like, I don't know. I don't know how to read that.
Yeah. So, I mean, Broadcom is interesting in that it is, for years, it was an acquisition story, right? They kept buying things and they bought all the semi companies until there were no semi companies left to buy. And then they switched to buying software companies. They bought one of the biggest software companies, right? They bought VMware, it was a massive software company. And then AI happened, and now they're a semiconductor company again. And I think that took them by surprise. But they don't care. There's money to be made, and they're going to run with this for as long as it takes. And it'll be interesting to see if they do another deal. It's been a while since they did their last one. It's been VMware closed last year. They don't seem in a hurry to do another deal.
Right.
They're spending their money on data centers, on AI investments. They could probably still do another one, but I don't think that's I don't know. I have no idea what's going to happen there. But certainly the software side of the business is doing just fine. He did make a case on the call for why VMware is still really important. Like you said, Hawk is very in tune to what people are saying about the company in the investment community. And so, of course, the week before earnings, we had this big SaaS meltdown with all the AI companies causing anxiety among SaaS investors. And he went out of his way to say, "Oh, VMware is safe. VMware is being used in all these AI deployments. You're still going to need lots of VMware and containers in deployments of scale AI systems," which I don't know is maybe true, but maybe beyond my probably, but beyond their scope.
Yes, I mean, I know there's varying degrees of the way this is executed to the point I'm about to make, but like almost every company that we talk to, who's doing AI software, when it manifests itself, it's running in virtual machines. So a lot of these components are running in those VMs. Whether they're all VMware, I don't know, but every hyperscaler runs. You run your cloud instances in virtual machines. So sure,
for now,
right? To the degree that it's VMware for whatever, but yeah, I mean, everybody's running to some degree. There's VMs in there for a whole host of different software applications, agentic included.
Yeah,
so
for now, right?
Yeah,
for now.
Yeah.
But the software side of Broadcom now is growing. I think it grew 15% last quarter, which is fine, but it's not exciting to talk about when the rest of the business is growing 100%. I think the part that interests me more is like the non-AI semis pieces, which is basically their business at Apple around wireless and filters and stuff like that. And they forecast that to grow. I think or I think it's gonna be flat. I can't remember the exact. If it's growing, it's not growing much. It's kind of flattish. Um, but we'll talk about Apple in a little bit. I think they're very much that business is very much levered towards what Apple is doing, and Apple I think is going to have a good year. We can get into that later.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump to Marvell. I like this. Obviously, they had the biggest pop still up today, so the street sort of really liked what they got to hear. I think there was some ease, concerns eased with the commentary on really the wider, longer guide, which just shows programs are ramping. They're not necessarily being designed out, like I think was part of the concern. Like we talked about last time, right? They were talking more about, look, we're still in a lot of these designs. It's again, it's on the periphery, but still an important part of the design process. Alchip had some interesting, what would be considered disappointing earnings from if you just read the top line. That was sort of the back and forth. Is Alchip taking more than Marvell? So it sounds like Marvell's back in the thick of this, ramping for the next couple of years with their specific customers. So anyway, it sounded good. Obviously, everybody liked what they heard. Feels like they're on a good trajectory, even if this year is it's up, but not a ton. But that's fine. But it sounds like once we get past this year, they've got line of sight to a lot of programs again accelerating. Very similar to Broadcom, but just not quite at the same scale. So what was the top takes on Marvell?
Yeah, Marvell has become this very controversial stock. And I tend to avoid it because it's very binary in the conversation to have about it, in the sense that people are have investors have very strong opinions about how good Marvell's custom ASIC business is, and most of that business is derived from Amazon and the Trainium line, and like every conversation I have about Marvell is, did they lose share at Amazon? Did they gain share? Or did they lose share? Or do they hold on to share? How much is Alchip getting? Right? Because
Yeah.
Alchip is a very different company. Alchip is sort of the low cost competitor here with radically lower margins than Marvell. And frankly, I find the whole debate exhausting. I think what's been clear is in the current generation of Trainium, Marvell held on to its share. I think we knew that a few quarters ago, but we are actually seeing it in numbers. I'm sure next week I'm going to have to start debating with people about whether or not what's the outlook for next year on Trainium, and I don't I don't know what the answer is. I'm not sure that I definitely don't want to have that debate with people, but that's the big story is like they're doing well at Amazon for now, and what you think about their future depends a lot on what you think about their prospects at Amazon, and or the possibility that they get sort of more volume someplace else like Microsoft. And okay, they're in a tough spot. I'm glad they had a good quarter. Um, and they have other interesting things going on. They have a pretty good optical story
Yep.
in the works with Celestial, and we'll,
Yep.
we'll see how that pans out. It's still another year or so from being really commercially proven or
Yep.
fully productized, but
Yep.
keep an eye
Yep.
on that one.
Yeah, I mean I think the second half of this year will start to give a lot more clarity to the shape of these ramps for them, and then again some of the value adds that Celestial is going to bring are on a couple of these timelines. So I think those are the things to watch. I mean, again, they are much more concentrated with a couple of customers than Broadcom, right? And so I think that's always been a key concern at the variance of back and forth. But I really do think, Amazon's ramping. I have no doubt to the degree. I haven't tried to figure out their unit volumes yet for Trainium 4, but it certainly keeps going up over 3, and 3 will scale, and Amazon is adding the most capacity and wattage of any of the hyperscalers. So they'll have greenfield to build, and yes, that's going to be GPUs as well. But so they've got the ramp to do it, the gigawatts to fill that with. But yeah, I think that's the back and forth. But I do think, like, my personal conviction. So this again just comes back to the optical timeline. Those customers that do start to shift or commit more of their design process to optical, I think Marvell will be right there. And in a degree that I think some of this shift to customer-owned tooling, which again, Hawk was asked about and was concerned about, we know Google is doing this to a degree and will continue to do more of it. That doesn't mean Broadcom loses it. It just might be the amount of IP they commit to that might be lower. But I sense that this will continue to happen with a number of customers, and I think Marvell will compete for that. So that's not settled. That's a variable. That's much more 27, 28 conversation. But the shape up's not bad, and I think the second half of this year, we'll hopefully see a bit more positives.
Yeah, and part of the issue with all of these is I know from up close that the hyperscalers have so much need that they're trying everything. And that applies to compute, that applies to networking, that applies to startups that they're working with. Like if you have something that's going to shave off, 1% of their energy costs on a $200 billion capex program, that's worth a lot of money, right? And so I know lots of categories where the hyperscalers have 2 or 3 or 4 competing projects, sort of pilot projects out there, and it makes it very confusing for everybody involved. Like nobody knows how it's going to turn out. But there's a lot of noise in the system, and so yeah, of course Google's working with their own tooling, but I don't think even Google expects all of these things to work. Right? They're going to try 3 or 4, and they're going to pick the best one, and I think it's tough to argue with Broadcom's success here and their value proposition. Does it last forever? Nothing does. So, but it looks pretty solid right now, and I think Marvell. We'll see. I'm not totally convinced yet. I would like to hear. I'd like to see them talk about more than just custom. I think there's more to this Marvell story that can be developed, especially in optical right now, but lots of areas.
Yeah, agreed. All right, tell me about what happened with Quen, the drama.
Yeah, so the big news in Chinese AI circles this week is the AI team at Alibaba, Quen, the people who gave us the Quen model, which is I think widely regarded as one of the best open-ish AI models available.
Yeah.
They had a major shakeup. A lot of like the head of the unit left, and a lot of other senior people left as well. And it's hard to know exactly what's going on. It's big companies, complex, and then throw in the fact that it's China. It's even harder to sort of parse. But it looks a lot like two things are happening. One is like every other company in the world that's spending a lot on AI capex. The senior management at Ali said, "Okay, let's start finding more commercial uses for all this AI investment." And the Quen team is very much focused on building ever better models. They're an R&D team, and they didn't like that. And think I think the sort of root cause of the disagreement was allocation of compute time, right? And this is a big topic inside all the hyperscalers, right? We talk about it from this high level as like, oh, Amazon can't get enough compute, Google can't get enough compute, Anthropic can't get it. If you're actually working inside one of those companies, what that means for you is you can't get enough compute, right? Everybody's sort of fighting for allocation of compute time. And it sounds to me like the Ali team, the Quen team, got allocated less compute than they wanted or felt that they needed, and so they left. And so I think it's interesting from our perspective of this sort of, we've been talking about this for a few episodes now, is this shortage of compute and shortage everywhere. Here's a way in which that's actually being felt beyond the scope of just semiconductors, is like causing a big shakeup internally at a pretty promising team. And not for nothing, all those people are also could just very well want new jobs, because the market for advanced AI researchers is as good as it's going to get. And so I'm sure all those people will have already found new jobs, right? It's interesting to me because it's a lot of drama, and it comes on the tails of, it seems like something similar happened at Meta at some point this last year. There's a lot of shakeup, a lot of internal what's going on, and it's a lot of this goes back to how much compute am I going to get to do my to my project.
Yep.
More semis, everybody. We need more semis.
Yeah, and I think I mean, we've talked about this too, and it's interesting. Like I was at a big investor dinner in Sandhill last night, and there was a handful of startups also there in AI. And really, like I was asking them, I was like, "Hey guys, like one, where you run on your compute?" And it was almost always either GCP or Azure. There was no AWS in there.
Hmm.
And I asked them, like, "Is that common? Are you hearing most kind of AI startups around here?" And they're like, "Yeah, it's pretty common." A lot of that had to do with OpenAI, the primary models. Now that Amazon has that, it should help. But what was, I think, really interesting was that they were sort of again pointing out how the lack of compute that they have access to, and how hard it is to just secure or button down compute anywhere. That they're basically like, we're going to try to get capacity everywhere we can come from. But again, then you come back to, right, the hyperscaler, like we were talking about, which is the tension of where do I allocate my compute, to dollars or to my own internal needs. And I just wonder, we talk about like they've got to make very specific and very poignant CapEx decisions. I get that. Tamad has, but I also wonder, like, is there a strategic decision you make that actually hurts you in the long run if you don't allocate enough compute to your internal teams, right? To keep up and train and do what you need. Again, Google as well, right? Because they're vertical, they're training their own models. They're up against that tension too. So it's a super interesting strategic dynamic about where are you willing to maybe fall behind or not, which is also a trade-off for revenue, while you're trying to bake, all of this underlying goodness into your own compute needs as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that we're I don't think we've quite seen this dynamic yet play out in the U.S. companies, right? Which is, so far, it seems like the people who are talking most about ROI on CapEx, getting return on all this AI investment, it's the financial community that is asking this. I don't know many people at the labs or at the hyperscalers who feel that pressure right now. Now, partly that's because a lot of the investment is going to the cloud, the compute cloud people who are able to sell anything they have to the
Right.
OpenAIs and the Anthropics of the world. Um, but it at some point we're going to hear more of this here as well, where the people who are doing the cutting edge research and building the biggest models are going to start getting less allocation than they want, because
Absolutely.
the finance people are going to be saying, hey, no, we need
Well,
to allocate to the product people.
yeah, but think about it this way, right? The bigger your CapEx investment, the larger the contracts you want from your customer. So if somebody comes into you and says, "Hey, I'm gonna give you a 7-year X gigantic," like, you're not gonna say no to that. You got it, but then you got to allocate compute to that, and you start getting more companies coming here waving dollars at you. Like, you're not gonna say no to that with the tension that you just described. And who's gonna get hurt? Probably the internal teams for that, which is just, you know what I mean? Like, uh,
Yeah. I mean, I know this is a not problem, but this is a big topic of debate at some of the neo clouds, right? Because they're going to sign up a deal with Microsoft for whatever, 5, 10, $20 billion. Microsoft's going to want all that capacity. What happens when that contract goes off in 5 years, right? You're going to have a lot of underutilized capacity if you don't spend, at least allocate some of that to commercial customers, small customers now.
yeah, I love this dynamic. It's super fascinating. The tension again when you need to return on that capital, internal versus internal or external, is a fascinating dynamic. Um, all right, last news topic. While the world was shortly paying attention to Mobile World Congress, Apple wanted to steal some of the limelight with a handful of announcements. One on Monday, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday, um, culminating on the most interesting thing Apple's launched in a long time, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. But new affordable iPhones, new Mac Pros and Air running M5, and some of the benchmarks have been sneaking out on this, and it looks like one of the most performant laptops that's ever existed in the history of humanity. And then for the first time, what Ben has been arguing Apple needs to do forever, if they want to take market share, launch a true current generation Mac under $800. And they did with the Neo that starts at $599. It runs an A series processor, which I think is a very interesting decision. Also not going to be a big a deal as people think. But $499 for a student discount, which is crazy. Like, you think about where Chromebooks are, you think about where students have been buying pretty terrible things for 200, 300 bucks. A little bit more, you can get yourself a Mac that's extremely capable. And I think there's a lot of people in the Windows world that buy $600-700 machines that want an entry point to the Mac. So this sucker becomes really interesting for them as an inflection point for the Mac. But you take the phone and you take this, and what it just, I think, shows you is, Apple is now at a point where they can manufacture at scale with their margins products that can meet price points that are more friendly and really give people a really good entry point into the ecosystem. And then that just goes from there, right? You get hooked, you might buy a more expensive device, the flywheel kicks itself in place. So really interesting strategic moves for them to keep being a little bit more affordable across the product lines.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a very, very strong year for Apple's share gains. Not its stock price, but its like market share, because they've now lowered the entry point to deep into Windows territory. I noticed on the phones too is that they still have a decent amount of memory.
Right.
Right. And I think that, this year's next round of iPhones are going to have the full component of memory. And that is going to be in sharp contrast to what we're seeing among certainly the Chinese handset vendors. I don't know where Samsung stands yet, but the Chinese handset vendors are all despeccing their phones and reducing the memory content in the phones because memory's gotten so expensive.
Yeah.
And I think Apple's just going to say, hey, we're going to have the same amount of memory. We'll eat the margin hit. Because we're going to make it up on services, and so we're not even going to see the impact in gross margins. It'll be a wash.
Yep.
And they're going to pick up all kinds of share.
Yep.
Because it's going to be a really, really difficult year for all their competitors, with the possible exception of Samsung, who may or may not get a discount on memory. Maybe not. We don't know.
Yeah. But I think though, to the point you made about NVIDIA too, I think Apple's willing to pay a bit of a premium for memory upfront for long-term capacity security. And I think they're in the ability to do that where others can't, and then make it really hard on everybody else. In fact, I'm working on a report that I'm calling Masters of the Supply Chain, that in this crunch, there are only a handful of people who are built to be true masters of the supply chain and use it to their advantage against their competitors in all of these areas of securing capacity. And that will put competitive dynamics on the rest of the ecosystem, just like you pointed out. And in this case, it puts it against what really is a strong market share segment for Windows PCs, where Apple doesn't have to pay for Windows. Apple doesn't have to pay for the SoC, from a third party at the same rate. So they've also got, this thing. I saw some of the videos, right? It's full milled chassis aluminum. It's going to feel like a Mac at that price. It's insane. You don't see full milled chassis metal aluminum sub $700 like anywhere. So, and we were just looking today, Max on my team trying to find. So it's already pushed. Most SKUs for it are already pushed back about 2 weeks for Neo. And I think when people see this in stores, it's going to be compelling, and I think it'll impress. I think the reviews will come out and show how capable the A18 is as a chip, especially at that price point. And I heard this great comment too. People were like, it's only got 8 gigabits of RAM. And it was sort of like, yes, right, that's fine. But if you're a person who's asking about RAM, you're probably not the target for this product anyway.
Yeah, yeah. It's. I've been dealing a lot with my kids' Chromebooks lately, and those aren't cheap. Well, they're low dollar amount, but they're for what you get. It's not cheap, and it's a painful experience. Uh, yeah, I'm gonna have to start thinking about Macs for them for school because just like they're inexpensive and these are pretty these look pretty good performance
I mean,
wise.
but again, right, this was the argument. You ask almost anybody who's buying, who's in the budget friendly camp for PCs, and you go, why don't you consider a Mac? And they always say it's too expensive. Like
Yeah,
that argument is almost entirely gone. I think there's parts of China this does really interesting with, to be honest with you. Mac has been on a tear in China. One of the areas where they constantly call out that's a half of Mac buyers are brand new to the Mac. So there's Mac curious people who want to get into the Mac for the first time. But again, right, it's always been expensive. So I'm very interested, right, to see how this goes. This could be one of the shortest term impacts to their bottom line and revenue growth from a category that we've seen if it takes off the way people think.
I just think it's gonna position them like I haven't I haven't thought through the numbers. I just think strategically they're gonna pick up a whole bunch of share in both Mac and phone this year, and it's gonna be difficult for everybody else. And what always happens is Apple eats up all the profits in a category, right? I mean, I've
Yeah,
been doing that
right.
analysis for years. Is
That's true.
Apple for a good decade, Apple had
Yeah,
110% of mobile phone profits,
yeah,
right? Because everyone
yeah,
else is losing money, and it's changed since then. But still, like they're going to move into this next category, and it's just going to be a much better product at a comparable price point, and it's going to push everyone else further down market. It's going to be a really difficult year for low end Android phones,
yeah.
right?
And again, to the fly of the wheel that we've talked about, right? The thing that Apple knows, and those who watch Apple is the steady truth that get them in the ecosystem, they
Right.
stay, they don't leave, and they continue to spend more money.
Right.
So it's like it just grows. So it's just a matter about getting new customers, and that's really what this is at. That I think is interesting. That and again, the iPhone continues to be very affordable and approachable for anybody. So it's like all the Max too expensive stuff, man, has gone down. Like I just think that's super interesting. So yeah, interesting year for Apple. And as I think maybe it's not this year, but they continue to set themselves up well with Apple Silicon for whatever might happen on device with agentic AI. They're building that base of devices that will be very capable. And that includes the Neo at $699 because A18 was no slouch. A18 Pro is no slouch of an SoC.
Yeah, I actually read a very strong case for Apple 2027. If you look at, they had made some guesses as to where the Apple Silicon architecture roadmap would be for 2027 and 2028, and if that's true, and if Apple's strategic about this, we get to a world in which somebody has figured out a way to productize OpenClaw and things like that,
Mm,
and you start running all
on
those
device.
things
Yeah.
on device,
Right.
right? I mean,
Right.
for my part, for those of you not, for those of you can see this on
Yeah.
video,
Jay's got one.
I got a Mac Mini this week, and I've been setting it up to run OpenClaw, and it's very cool what it can do, but it is a beast to set up, and
It is.
it is like, and like security wise, it's just forget about it, it's a complete
Yeah.
joke.
We
But
should
like,
not talk about security.
but at the same time, like Apple knows a thing or two about fixing this. So again, it's very hard for me to judge where their AI head is at. But if the old Apple is still in there, they can do some pretty incredible things with the iPhone. Call it in 2027, 2028.
Yeah. So I don't want to jump off this, although we're closing without talking about what they did with M5 Pro and Max because I think it's a chiplet, but it's also not like full chiplet because there's basically call it two hemispheres where if you remember, Ultra was two SoCs bonded together, so two full die blocks put together. They have now split those blocks. So the CPU and the NPU is on one part, and then it is basically stitched together via Silicon Bridge with the GPU. What I thought about this, though, is, okay, what this does is now it actually lets them mix and match those two things accordingly, right? So, for example, let's say they want to put in the Air, right, the base Air or whatever next year, a really big GPU and a mix and match of smaller E cores to mid-size cores, right? They have that optionality now in an interesting way. So you can kind of scale NPU, CPU, and GPU independently of each other with whatever you want. I think that's interesting. The other thing I was thinking about is, all right, what does that now do for something like Ultra, right? Where they again were bonding two SoCs together. Now they've got maybe 4-ish or possibly more different block options that they can put together in this chiplet-ish, I'm still going to call it a chiplet, but chiplet-ish approach. It's really interesting how they took this approach. Again, I'm going to say it's their first true chiplet, but it's not a Lunar Lake or Panther Lake type of chiplet, but it's getting there. Apple will get there at some point. Anyway, I think these design choices are interesting, is what I'm bringing up.
Is it at all similar to what AMD was talking about last week for Meta?
I don't know. I don't.
Because and the reason I ask, it's a little bit out off the wall, I know, but it's like there. I think there are interesting things happening with chiplets now, which people have seen coming for a while, but now we're actually starting to see them in products. You're starting to really mix and match things in interesting ways. And so
so we don't know the architecture there, but basically, like, the way I think about it is where the tiles are stitched together, you can just sort of look at that relative to the area and just sort of see what are your options, right? Because you're going to be like, you can't just replace half of that with the GPU. So you can't just go, oh, I can get rid of these 2 blocks and add a GPU. I'm limited to, like, what area can my GPU scale horizontally, vertically, like, where did I put it? But that's my point. If the GPU is a tile to Apple, which it is to everybody who makes chiplets, but the CPU and the NPU are one tile, eventually that gets split up and then you just do what you want. But their NPU has stayed pretty steady at 16 cores for some time, and it doesn't appear like they have any need to change that. So what they're going to change, that's always going to stay the same, and they're going to just basically change the CPU amount, right, relatively as they want, and then the GPU cores now have neural cores in them, so accelerators. I just think it's interesting how they've chosen to take this approach, and then what optionality that gives them to mix and match, because that's what makes tiles interesting. You basically got Legos, put them together. Do you want 4 cores? Do you want 8 cores? Do you want X cores? How many? Great. But Apple's been the one that's been consistent on NPU, hasn't grown, and CPU changes. And then what this brings with it is they have now named their highest end cores super cores. And because if you looked at M5 before, which I thought was interesting, the E cores kind of disappeared. And we were like, what happened to the E cores? You basically have variants of P cores now that we can tell. And all they did is they basically were like, we're renaming, the P cores what they are, and then we're adding super cores, which is a much higher performant architectural bit of ARM. So which choice they used. And there's fewer of them, but they're extremely capable. And this V9 gives them this option to do this and scale that up. But anyway, I'm just saying, like, if you just come at a design point and everybody has to analyze the design choices everybody makes for their SoCs, this is an interesting one. And Apple now has more variability than before, given this kind of split die approach that they're taking, which, again, I'm going to call it a chiplet, but people will argue with me and say it's got to have 5 tiles to be a chiplet, or 4 tiles. It's like, all right, it's got 2 tiles. They didn't used to have 2 tiles on a laptop. It was only, anyway. All right, forget
people argue with you about that.
Yes, yes, they do.
Okay.
It's fine. All right, it's fine. Okay. Thanks for listening, everybody. It's been a good week of stuff. The semiconductor industry does not slow down. So until next week, we'll talk to you then.
Thank you, everybody. Leave us a review. Tell your friends. Watch us on YouTube. Thanks for listening.